So welcome to the Jonathan and Barbara Silver Foundation in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. My name is Michael Brenson. I'm the artistic director of the foundation, and the mission of the foundation is to protect, preserve, and expand the legacy of Jonathan Silver. One of the ways we do that is through our programming, and we were really excited earlier in the year to initiate our first grant in the first cycle. It's a grant for writing on sculpture, and I'm impressed and humbled by the applications we received, and that grant will be awarded in the fall. Today we're initiating another program, and that is an occasional series of conversations at the foundation about Jonathan's work. And each time I will invite someone to come in and speak with me. The first person who's doing that today is Bob Taplin, who is a sculptor and a writer. The guests will choose a work. I will choose a work. We'll begin by talking about the work that the guest has chosen, a really unscripted conversation that will go wherever it needs to go. And one of the purposes of this is to open up Jonathan's work and to reveal how much it has to offer. So the work we're beginning with today is Birth of Venus. That's this sculpture between us. Beside me, it's a little bit more than 7 feet tall. It was made in 1986. This is the original plaster from clay. Through the 70s, Jonathan primarily made heads, and their frontal heads, they're cubistic, sort of. He was very involved with challenging notions of narrative. And around 1980, he started to make figures, and he went in the other direction, and narrative started to come in, storytelling, references to classical art, Greek, Roman, Egyptian. This particular work was made in 1986, which I mentioned. It was, there's another plaster version of it. It was cast twice, and in the course of the casting, when Jonathan got the work back, the right arm of the figure went away. It was lost in the casting, and we didn't get it back. The figure's right arm, which has a long, it's sort of a long bony arm with an elbow sticking out, and the hand with very long fingers is holding something like an offering. And one of the writers referred to it as a conch shell because that would lend itself to the myth of the birth of Venus. I don't know what it is. It's like a boomerang-shaped thing. It looks a little bit like an animal. It looks like it could be food, but it's part of the odd kind of symbolism that gets into the work. And if any of you see the images and have some idea of what it is, please let us know. So just a word about Bob Taplin. He's a sculptor and writer. As I mentioned, we've known each other for really since the 80s, since my years at the New York Times, and I followed Bob's work through different stages. We've had a number of, to me, really amazing conversations about figurative sculpture and sculpture in general, and the challenges and the difficulties of making figurative sculpture of a certain kind in a way that makes sense in the contemporary world. Like, how does this work? How does it belong to the past? How does it belong to the present? In what ways can the work actually project itself, or maybe perhaps even prophesize the future? So these are all questions that I suspect will come up, and I turn it over to Bob, who will begin the conversation and let us know why he chose this work.
All right, so Jonathan's work is something I've been aware of, as Michael said, since the 80s. I wrote a review of one of his shows at Victoria Monroe when I was working with Art in America. And Silver has always struck me as somebody who was fascinating because of the kind of the conflicting impulses that you can see in almost every one of his works. There's something they kind of refuse to settle down. And you know, this is an example in that The Birth of Venus, classical reference, most people would think of Botticelli, the Venus on the half shell coming ashore. Instead, you've got a severely anti-classical figure, extended proportions, broken up in pieces, refuses to unify, refuses to settle down. So there's this classical, anti-classical dynamic going on. And then there are other, I think, contradictory sort of dynamics. There's a realist, anti-realist dynamic. You look at some of Silver's drawings and they're these incredibly precise, geometrically resolved, observational drawings. Some of his other sculptures are a form of realism, particularly the ones involved with his wife. And then there's this process-oriented, expressionistic, anti-realist impulse where you can't put the body back together again. It falls out within the structure of a figure. The head's still on the top. It doesn't have two heads. The feet are still on the bottom. One of the things that intrigues me about this particular piece is I mean, Silver was very interested in Giacometti. Okay, and so Giacometti used those extremely extended proportions, but this piece, to me, reminds me most of a Romanesque figure on a French Gothic cathedral. The extremely extended proportions, the sort of sense that it's drifting. It has no relation to gravity, no relation to the plinth. It doesn't stand on its plinth. It's not relating to the ground. It's afloat. Of course, there's also all sorts of modernist impulses in here. The desire to, Michael and I were talking about earlier, there's almost a feeling that Silver liked to take the figure, break it up into pieces, and then recollage it into something different. And so there's that modernist abstracting drive to make it into something, if not unrecognizable, highly fungible, highly unresolved in a classical way. And then there's the strong expressionistic desire, you know, and in the expressionist world, there's the sense that the markings, the fact that you've ripped a piece out of the torso, that you've broken the leg, that you've turned these things around, that there's a gouge in the face, those things, the expressionist illusion is that those things are registers of the artist's psyche. That's the illusion, that somehow that is a register of the way the artist's psychology was at the moment when he did that. And it's kind of an illusion. And yet, it's a compelling illusion. Because, of course, Silver was highly compositional, as is every expressionist artist. They're thinking exactly what's going to happen when I create this cavity? How's that cavity going to relate to this cavity? How's that slice going to relate to that slice? So there's a formalism to expressionism that's kind of in contradiction to this illusion of the artist's spontaneous psychological expression.
I've got I think, you know, your comment about expressionism is interesting, and I think he spent the 70s. We have these drawings around us too, and the heads are very involved with visual observation.
Yes,
and really trying to understand what a head is,
yeah,
and figuring it out spatially, and figuring it out one part in relation to another part. This then becomes much more expressionist. If there's an element of visual observation in this, I'm not sure exactly what it is. It seems much more, there is some kind of idea of Venus, and we can talk about it. And then there's this tremendously expressionist handling of the material. I mean, even the way the clay exists there, and what you're talking about, the really strangeness of the legs. I really like what you say about the Romanesque and the Gothic. And that too makes me wonder, is it a contradiction that Venus is a Roman goddess, and yet we're in Gothic and Romanesque, although, you know, they also had their own ways of responding to antiquity. But there's a particular way in which that head is like an angel, right? From this side, not from your side. From the side of where you are, where it's just, you know, it's kind of, right, it's kind of cut.
Cut off.
So it's a double image, and I don't read that as necessarily aggressiveness or aggression. I'm curious how you think about it. It seems more like a kind of violation, like maybe on one side this is a protective image that's capable of looking down over people and protecting them like an angel in some way, and then the other side of it is an image that in itself is totally in need of protection, yeah, right? Vulnerable. Completely vulnerable.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you look at the heads, and we'll probably talk about it a little bit in the head that Silver was he liked molds, and he was interested in the convex-concave problem, right? So he would take a mold of a convex form and then use that as part of the sculpture in reverse. And so this is that inside-outside thing. And so the caved-in part of the head, in a sense, is the rendering of the head can give you this sense of an interior life, of mind, of soul, but then the actual caved in, the reverse, is a sort of structural, you know, penetration of the volume of the head, which, yeah, it's hard not to read as violent and aggressive, but it's also very formal. It's a mask thing, a turning the head inside out a little bit.
Well, this side of the head, there's certainly, you know, a kind of inwardness to it, right?
Oh yeah.
But it's a different. But then you get that's right, a soulful. But then the other side of it, where it's more literally, you know, a kind of inwardness, and then the inwardness is no longer some kind of gentle, dreamy state, but
yeah, and then you've got, you know, the division right down the middle, which is, of course, where we haven't talked about process and everything yet, but of course that's the parting line of where the clay was molded, and those parting lines, of course, were used as an expressive element in Rodin. You know, he was the one who said, no, leave those. Mm-hmm. And he liked them because they follow the contour. That's what a mold maker does, is he finds the high spots and sets that. But in this case, again, it's just a strict left, it's a division of the head. It's like there's a seam right down the middle. You know, the body is this full, you know, what Rodin said, a bunch of lumps and hollows. And it's the lumps have a very different emotional tenor than the hollows. The hollows are associated, are kind of sexual and sensual, and the lumps are aggressive and muscular, are, you know. And so by turning the head into a hollow, you've reversed your expectations in just a very simple, obvious way, but it's a big deal.
Well, I want to, like, this idea of two kinds of inwardness is interesting to me, because there's no question there, you know, with the angel, the particular soulfulness, this side of the head, But I think Jonathan was partly interested in these notions of reversals, like
Yes.
you do a head, you open it up, you take a slice, you turn it around, you plant it in the other side. So somehow it's almost like we're still looking, we've gotten inside the head in some way that's uncomfortable, like the head that you're looking at. And the other side, we get like an inwardness that's very respectful. And very respectful, and and reassuring, and it's angelic like. But one is quite precise, the naturalistic side, and then the side of the reversal is not at all that. And then it seems to open up some kind of psychological territory that connects for me with the extraordinary disjunctiveness of the body. And
Absolutely.
I wondered whether you'd say more about it, because the shoulders are obviously so different, the legs are so different.
Yeah. Well, we were talking earlier about the fact that from my point of view over this angle, which I think is sort of the dominant view of the sculpture, it's as if this leg, it's as if he's doing this.
Right.
It's this crossed-legged thing, which again is so typical of a Romanesque figure, right? The Romanesque saint with those crossed legs and the feet down at the bottom. But yeah, but then I come around this side, and again, it's completely disjunctive. From this side, it's almost like we're looking as if the whole torso is turned backwards, and we're looking at the back of a calf, and then by the time you get down here, we're looking almost, I mean, they are feet, but they're almost like goat's feet. It's like, I'm thinking Marsyas and Apollo, the famous, Apollo stripping Marsyas of his skin. So again, yeah, completely reversing your expectations. Well, not completely, but greatly reversing your expectations as you change the different views of the sculpture. And that's without going all the way around it.
Right. But come over here where I am.
Yeah, this is such an awkward view.
Because when you look at it this way, then the figure becomes almost complete. I mean, and then it becomes, for me, a little bit like a Greek maiden, or I mean, and then it becomes one body, like grafted onto another body. But when you look at it from the other side, or where you are, it is completely one body.
I'm now seeing, in fact, there's a division right here and a division right here.
Right.
And this section here is highly ambiguous from this side. And you're just not anatomically, I mean, you just can't decide where you're at. Especially in contrast to up here. I mean, I'm very much in a rib cage, in a tummy, and then am I in a pelvis? God, I have no idea. And then suddenly I'm back into some legs. Yeah. Of course, you got to remember that the birth of Venus is another incredibly violent event in Greek mythology. That's Saturn sneaking up on his father Uranus, cutting off his genitals, throwing them in the ocean, and Venus comes ashore as his sort of last ejaculation. So underneath all that classical poise and Botticelli, on the half shell, is this violent, archaic mythology. And I tend to imagine, Silver was a pretty literary guy, right? I tend to imagine he knew exactly what that story was all about. And maybe that, related to his sense of violence and disjunction. Although I don't know.
I feel like what you say is true, in that the Venus myth, this figure, was on some level really important to Jonathan, but it's very hard to actually decipher what that is. But on another level, once the title is given, it's provocative enough that we don't necessarily have to know it, because what's going on these various formal levels that you were talking about are so intriguing and disconcerting and challenging in themselves.
And then what about the relation to abstract expressionism? You know, we know that almost all of those painters, and of course, our boy Mr. Smith is the exception, but they were mostly painters. They all came out of that sort of totem and taboo world of Freud, thinking, most of them made Pollock made those early paintings that were highly totemic.
Right.
And so Abex emerges into that abstract world from that totemic surrealist world. And there's an abstract expressionist impulse in Silver, don't you think?
Say more.
Well, just the sense that the marking itself has a validity. I mean, again, this is expressionism, but abstract expressionism. I mean, they weren't. Pollock, a lot of the abstract expressionist painters, of course, found a way to sort of create their expressionism in a hands-off way. So you finally get to like Barney Newman, where there's no more hand there. But was Silver associated with Agostini and some of those people who were, there was a whole sort of ambiguous moment there. Manuel Neri, there were a bunch, the sort of isolated figurative sculptors of that era. A lot of them seem to have some relationship to that Abex world, to that, that's almost that de Kooning-esque.
Well, Agostini was his teacher.
Was Silver's teacher?
Yeah, it was Jonathan Silver at Columbia.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, no, I didn't know that. Yeah.
And I don't know about Neri. I think that there are a set of permissions that are built into abstract expressionism in terms of where you can go and how you can allow the unconscious to work, and coming out of surrealism. Right. that were important for Jonathan, and maybe even more so, like those people, Pollock, Smith, Rothko, toward the notion of ritual and toward this kind of affinity with or sympathy for ritual experience in art as it had manifested itself in some continuity. Going back at least to Egypt, and because there is, you feel in this work like somehow in these disjunctive acts and the cutting of the head, of the turning the legs around, whatever's going on to the body here, it feels like almost sacrificial and ritualistic in a way, to use the word primitive, in a way that goes back in time, and I think
that's interesting, because the expressionist impulse, as we think of it, is an expression of the artist's pain. Right?
Right.
And you're right. That's not really what you're feeling, or it's not the only thing you're feeling in here. The violence and the
that's so interesting,
the
because
sacrificial idea is
the work is very personal on some level, but also on another level, not so much. And it's hard to get to it.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I had not thought of it that way. But I very much see what you're saying, and that, to me, again, as an old medievalist, that relates back into that world of the Gothic world, where sculpture functions absolutely as an image of sacrifice. That was very much what it was: martyrs and saints and Jesus Christ. Yeah. So within the Christian world, now of course.
And he made images of Christ, of Jesus, and Mary,
really?
and Mary.
Silver did.
Yeah, he did.
Okay. Oh my God! All right. Okay, so see, these are things I didn't know.
Right.
That's fascinating. So I wonder. Did he Yeah, did he have an interest in those old Romanesque churches?
Oh,
Or is that
remember
just
Meyer
coincidental?
Shapiro, who was
Yes.
his
Oh, of
great
course, who
teacher.
wrote the great book on
Uh,
early Romanesque.
that's right.
Oh my God, sure, of
So
course.
he would have been introduced. I don't think he would have visited the Romanesque cathedrals, but he would have been introduced
Oh, of course.
to medieval art
That's incredible.
early on through Shapiro.
Because that book was an absolute fundamental book for me.
Mm,
And Shapiro was the one who showed you that that incredible zigzag
right,
sense of composition in Romanesque art was not a mistake. It was highly intentional and highly sophisticated, and that was an absolute key moment for me.
right,
And I'm seeing that in here, that this business,
right,
that
right,
zigzag,
right.
and that has something with the offset shoulders and all of that stuff. So of course Shapiro, that's amazing because I didn't know that.
But this is an expressionism that makes me, and when I think of that arm, which is in here, I think more of like Sheila.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I go back more towards German expressionism, so that there's a way, even here too, that there's a kind of syncretism, at work of, I mean, it's strange, we're talking, it feels so complex to me, and that he had access to it, but I wonder if like all these different directions and what's going on in the body, like didn't on some level not tear him apart. That's too far. But what was going on inside him?
That was where I started thinking about this. Was there is some expression of conflict,
Right.
Personal conflict in here. Yeah, you can't say there isn't. There has to be, and it's a question of what formal means will allow me to channel that, whatever it is, that violence, that pain, that rage, into an image that settles to some degree. I mean, and this just barely settled.
So to talk about the notion of balance here and the armature and what I'm interested in, where you feel like the armature could pose a problem, because it seems like he's also, this is pretty balanced down to here, and then it goes like haywire. Like it seems like he's fighting as much as he can against some equilibrium.
It's kind of crazy and unresolved, and I like it. It seems to me that this is sort of, he was really fighting it out here, and I appreciate that. Once it was cast in bronze, the finality of the metal also does something to make it a one thing. We're still seeing this as parts, really, or I am as parts.
Right, and this is like a part in itself too.
Yeah, exactly. That you feel like you could almost just pull
but
that out.
It makes me feel like talking about it, like in some, it's broken in some ways, and it's a fragment, and in a kind of ruin. And he was certainly someone who was interested in that idea, but it also feels sufficient and curiously sufficient. I mean, it's not the work he intended, but you can get so much out of it.
And that arm makes a big difference, right? Vroom, vroom.
Right.
That changes the situation down here. There's a big volume right out here. And that may be also why that photograph of the bronze looks more like a unified sculpture. Because it is. That was a key part of the composition. The transition from this to bronze is enormous.
Well, I don't know. I think it was around 85, 86 that Sitsinger had his first works, maybe 86. So it was right around this time. And I think he was making figures maybe up to then that he maybe had some dream or fantasy about their becoming bronze. And then at a certain point, bronze began to become something that might actually happen because of Sid Singer's
Right,
patronage. But yeah, this is like he wasn't thinking about it.
Yeah.
That it wasn't a part of the intention of the way it was made. He was just making. He was here making what he felt like he had to make.
Right. Yeah.
When we talk about his personal relationship to the work, my intuition is that it was important or significant to him to have this work in the studio and day after day to go back, you know, to the clay and to have it around and to look at it and also to feel that he was being looked at by it. Do you think that's like completely off the wall?
I compared to everything else in here, I can see that. Absolutely. You know, despite the disruption and everything we're talking about, the dislocation and the violence in the thing, it does have it has a strangely peaceful feeling for all that, especially compared to a lot of the other works the other figurative works that are in here. Yeah. No, I can see it. Especially, you know, we didn't get to talk about that offering, that hand with the offering, but that's, you know, the peplos chore, that's the traditional gesture of, you know, as we're saying, of it's going to be okay.
Thank you.
Great.